This is Ted Hicks from Late Night Parents. Ways to follow the show, latenightparents.com. What's all the huff and fuss about Deion Sanders and him leaving the historically black college? And we're going to find out why people are so upset. So, college football fans and HBCU alumni are coming to the terms with Deion Sanders announcing his departure from Jackson State University for his new head coaching gig at the University of Colorado. The move struck a chord, especially with the alumni of the Mississippi College, with some calling Sanders a sellout for leaving a historically black Jackson State University for a predominantly white Colorado University. Others are angry about him selling the dream of changing the athletic culture at historical black colleges and universities or HBCUs across the U.S. and leaving after only 3 years. So while some were hopeful about everything Sanders said he could accomplish for JSU and other HBCUs, they failed to realize this history of segregation, the history of integration, and the history of the way TV contracts work really put these schools behind the eight ball, so to speak. It's complicated, but the anger, the confusion, the disappointment about Sanders' move stem from a culture of loyalty and reverence for the history that's unique to HBCUs. So let's look into the conversation that's fueled last week's debate. So why is there a debate? Sanders had been coaching the JSU Tigers for the past 3 seasons, compiling a 26-5 record, and most recently winning the Southwestern Athletic Conference Championship over Southern University. So the school took a chance on Sanders, who had no collegiate coaching experience. He had previously been the offensive coordinator at Trinity Christian School, a private school near Dallas. What he did was bring exposure to both Jackson State and HBCUs overall. And Sanders was quoted as saying, I can be an assistant in any college or a head coach at any college. But at the same time, God called me to Jackson State and me to these men. This is something that Sanders has said in 2020 when it was announced that he'd be the new head coach. Sanders also promised to basically change the HBCU landscape, in essence becoming a savior for HBCU athletics and putting these schools on the map. That he did, sort of. Since his arrival, JSU was featured on ESPN's First Take, ABC's Good Morning America. The school was showcased at the 2021 NBA All-Star Game and was even featured in a Pepsi ad. Sanders donated half of his salary to complete renovations to the school's football stadium. All of this in the span of 3 years gave many hope that he was in it for the long run. That obviously was not the case. And it's quoted, Bomani Jones is quoted by saying, you weren't going to bring this attention to these other schools in the time period he was there. If he was really going to accomplish that, that's a 10-year program at least. Additionally, what Sanders didn't take into consideration was the culture of loyalty at HBCUs. Billy Hawkins, a professor at the University of Houston, is quoted as saying there's an assumption that HBCUs breed this loyalty, definitely among its alumni, definitely among athletes, and supposedly among coaches, and Deion Sanders demystified that. 2 HBCU coaches known for their long tenures include Eddie Robinson from Grambling State University, head football coach between the 1940s and 1990s, and Jake Gaither, who led Florida A&M's program from 1945 to 1969, according to the Black College Hall of Fame. but it's problematic to expect coaches to stay for such a long time. So when you look at HBCUs, they probably, basically the only institutions that had that type of institutional memory in athletic coaching. Okay, so what does this highlight? Sanders' arrival and departure from JSU speaks to many issues of history and equity. HBCUs were created by Black Americans who were barred from attending predominantly white institutions. Officials at these institutions initially did not even want sports programs because Black athletes rarely went professional in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Despite this, football was introduced at HBCUs in the 1890s. According to the nonprofit American African American Registry, it wasn't until after World War II that the golden age of Black college football began, and HBCUs were producing more talent per capita than just about any other school in the country. These schools had tiny budgets, but because of segregation, were able to produce this wealth of talent. Between 1962 and 2002, Jackson State had 94 players drafted into the NFL. The school had 11 players drafted in 1968 alone, breaking a then Mississippi State record, according to its website. So integration in the late 1960s and early 70s ended the golden age. HBCUs used to be seen as the mecca of Black intellectual ability. Now, with the drain that took place or the migration of Blacks to predominantly white institutions, both as students and as athletes, there's that perception that, they're less than. Along with the absence of resources, there's a notion and ideology of intellectual inferiority. And I think that spills over into athletics as well. Thus, they don't necessarily receive the same types of sponsorships and endorsements because there's this assumption that there's an inferior performance. So in 1984, the Supreme Court ruling that widened the gap between HBCUs and their counterparts even more. The ruling said the NCAA could no longer control these games aired on television. Conferences like the SEC, ACC, Big Ten were now able to negotiate TV with TV networks directly. So all small colleges get shut out of this TV funding model because people at ABC don't want to see Dartmouth or Grambling. And historically, because of the lack of generational wealth among many Black families in the U.S., HBCUs don't have the wealthy donor base. So combine a history of segregation, a loss of resources to integration, and a lack of equity, getting multi-million-dollar deals, TV deals, and HBCUs get left behind financially and athletically. Then comes Deion Sanders, who talked about rebuilding the JSU brand, bringing in recruits, and amplifying HBCUs to the mainstream. So he sold the big dream. Now, if you paid any attention, you knew the dream he was selling wasn't possible. It was not an achievable one that he had, but he sold it and he was able to get people to believe it. Then he chucked the deuce and left, states Bomani Jones. Sanders' move out west also highlights another issue in college sports, the lack of Black head coaches in big league schools. His move is definitely a progress for Black coaches in college football. Sanders is one of the 3 HBCU coaches to go to a PWI and the first to go to a Power 5 school. A Black head coach has never won a football bowl subdivision, the top tier of Division I national championship. They don't usually get that chance. So, all right, what does this mean for HBCUs going forward? So in recent years, seen a resurgence of interest in HBCUs from of the election of Vice President um, Kamala Harris, Harvard University alumni, to companies increasing recruitment among HBC units, students, and Ralph Lauren collaborating with Morehouse and Spelman colleges in Atlanta. The New York Times even reported that the current climate has led to elite Black students to choose HBCUs over PWIs. Sanders was part of the resurgence and played a part, bringing even more eyes to these schools. Nobody was even talking about HBCUs, says Shannon Sharp, a Hall of Famer and HBCU alumni, on his Fox show Undisputed. They're on television, and that's because of Dion. He gave you the blueprint, now follow the blueprint. Part of the blueprint, experts said, is HBCUs not needing to follow that path of larger colleges, but instead remembering the product and that makes them unique to their fan base. So at HBCUs, the entire experience is a cultural expression. Marching bands and their electrifying halftime shows that make a football game a combination of music and sports. The schools also offer a space for Black students where they don't have to represent the entire race, remembering these elements of what makes their experience unique and will help Jackson State move forward after Sanders. It's going to take a visionary administrator, not just an athletic director, to wed the academic mission, the culture mission, and the athletic mission to really help propel not just the individual school forward, but all Black schools. And that was part of the story and just overall thoughts on primetime, moving forward and stepping away from JSU and going to CU. This is Ted Hicks, Late Night Parents.